This is part 7 of the Craftsman Emerson Gen 2 drill press rebuild. If you haven't seen part 6, click the link at the top of the screen. In this video, we're going to be cleaning and polishing a couple more parts. We'll be working completely on the motor and finishing it, and then we will start the final assembly. Hello everyone, I'm Jeff, and welcome to my shop. We got a lot to cover, so let's get to it. So to start off, we're going to be cleaning up the feed handle knobs. I've got an old feed handle rod that I've chucked into my lathe, and I can spin each knob onto it, and then I can sand these and polish them. So I'm just going to wet sand them. They're in really good condition, so I'm just going to remove the overall outer surface. So I'm just using 800 and 1000 grit. After they've been sanded, I apply the Meguiar's cleaner polish wax with a paper towel, and then after it's applied, then I'll buff it. And I do this with all of these red Bakelite knobs. I don't do it with the black knobs, but I do it with the red knobs for sure. And it puts a pretty good, nice shine on them. So if they have any nicks or anything like that on them, then I might use a little bit more aggressive sanding before I polish them. But these were in really good condition. So here we are with the stator, and unfortunately, the way this motor is designed, and most of your newer motors are going to be this way, the stator is welded inside the stator band, so you can't really clean up the stator band by itself or fabricate a new one. So the product I'm using here to clean up everything is Lectra Motive Electrical Parts Cleaner. You can get it at Home Depot or any of your big box stores, but it's non-conductive. And then after I got the windings and everything cleaned up on the inside, I'm very carefully using the wire wheel to clean up the stator band on the outside. So this is, has a high probability of you causing damage if you're not sure what you're doing here, because we've got wires hanging out and everything. But we're taking special care to not get anything near the windings. All it takes is breaking one of those windings and that motor's trash. So just cleaning it up with smaller. We're getting smaller and smaller with the wire wheels and Scotch-Brite wheels to get it into the smaller areas. Once we got everything cleaned up on the outside, we're going to go ahead and tuck all the wires into the center, and then we're going to start taping everything down. So we can paint everything except for the windings and the wires. So that's what we're going to be masking off. And we'll just do this for both sides of the stator. And you can kind of see how I end up closing off the big open area there. So once we've got it fully masked, then we're going to go ahead and prime it with the metal etching primer, just like we did for all the other parts. And I forgot to turn the video camera on to video me painting it, but it's just one more part. It's not like it's anything different. We paint it just like we would in any of the other parts. So we prime it and then we paint it. And here we are after the paint has cured. So we're just going to remove the masking. Now we painted the end bells back when we painted the head and the base and the table and all that stuff. So those are already done. So here's the data plate for the motor, and we're just cleaning it up with some of that Meguiar's cleaner wax, just like we did the model number data plate for the drill press itself. And when we go to reattach it, we're using number 4 1/4" panel screws or drive screws. Again, you can get those from McMaster Car. I think a box of like 100 cost me like $5, $7, something like that. So we just start them by hand. Then we use a brass punch and our hammer. And we didn't have to take that off. We could have just taped over it and painted everything, but that's how we did it. There we go. So here I'm just reinstalling the thermal protection switch and the terminal board with the switch built into it. And I had said when we disassembled this that sometimes the bearing sits between the switch and the end bell. And on this motor it doesn't, so we don't have to worry about that. But I didn't know that when we were taking it apart. So what I just installed are the spacer rings. They're basically round shims. And then I've got the bearing and a bearing setter to just seat that bearing. And then we can go ahead and install this end on the stator. And here I'm just looking through the holes that are on the edges of the stator that the long screws go through to line up the end bell. So here we have the rotor, and we need to reassemble the switch that is on this. So luckily this switch is really simple. It's not complicated at all. But I still took pictures with my phone as I disassembled it so that I could make sure that we could reassemble it properly. And the diagram, most of your motor diagrams are not going to show how to disassemble these switches, which is why most people don't even bother taking them apart. They just clean everything with that switch still on the rotor. But I like taking them off and cleaning all the parts. And here we are just reattaching the 2 side springs for it. And once we get it, do the other side. And then we test it to make sure it's working. Yep, good to go. Set that aside. So we've got 2 retaining rings that go on the rotor on each shaft. And this is what stops right at the bearings. So once we get the switch side on, we can go ahead and insert the rotor through the end bell and the bearing that's already in there. And it's not completely seated here, so we can just drive it down, and now it's seated. Just give it a little twist to make sure it's, yep, running fine. So we need to go ahead and install the retaining ring on this end. And then we've got the bearing for this end. These are Nachi bearings that I'm using. Great bearings, made in Japan. So we've got the spring washer. That's to take up any play in the bearing or in the rotor. And then the bearing itself. And then we seat the bearing. Then we go ahead and install the end cap, line it up. And we'll push it on there as best we can. And then we'll close up the motor with those long screws. So we can just insert those long screws. Sorry, I'm in the way. And then line up the two ends. And then tighten it down, and we'll just work our way around. Kind of like if you were doing lug nuts on a tire or on a wheel. And that'll close up the motor. So once we got the motor closed up, we can go ahead and finish connecting all of the wiring. And luckily the wiring diagram for this motor is very, very accurate. So here I've got a new power cord. I'm going to be replacing that one that's on the bench. And I'm going to cut it to length, and then I'm going to go ahead and strip off the sheath on it. And then I'll install terminal ends on there. And then we'll install a wire relief on the wire itself so it won't pull out. And then we put the terminal cover back on. So the last thing we need to do is install the capacitor. Get the tape off of those two wires. And then snap the capacitor into the cover. And then screw the cover back on the stator. And then I've got a plug strip that I've turned off. We can plug the motor directly into it. And then turn it on. running like a champ. Make sure we're not going to electrocute ourselves. No smoke. So we'll turn it off and listen for the click, which is the switch disengaging. And we're good to hook. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and install the column collar. So these come with all of the Emerson Gen 2, 3, 4s, and 5s. And it's designed to be mounted directly under the head. I like mounting them under the table, a couple inches below the table. That way, when I'm moving the table, if it gets out of my hands, it'll stop before it falls all the way. But here I'm installing it at about 6 1/4 inches, because that's where the head needs to stop. So we're just using a 1/2 inch ratchet, tightening it down. Next, we've got the switch panel plate. And I've already installed the plug here, and we're just going to snap the switch in. I'm referring to the parts diagram that's on the other side of the head there to make sure I'm putting everything back together in the direction it needs to face. And then we've got the light socket that goes right in the center. We're going to set that aside. So I said we were going to reuse the original power cable that came with this drill press because it was in really good condition. It was just dirty. So we're going to clean it with some simple green. And if you do this, after you clean it with the simple green, you're going to want to rinse it off, and then you're going to want to let it hang dry for a day or two. Make sure there's no water left anywhere on it. So I'm just using a Scotch-Brite pad and a toothbrush to clean it up. And then after it's been rinsed and dried, I'm over at the wire wheel, and I'm just going to clean the actual electrical plug for it. It's fine, but I just want to clean it up a little bit, get that brass shiny on it. And then after we've cleaned it up, we're ready to install it. So it just like all the other parts there, it snaps right into that plate. Just like that. There was a little bit of play in it, but you can use a flat tip screwdriver to kind of expand the clip for it on the underside, and it'll take up that play. So here we are, ready to go ahead and rewire all of this. So I'm just twisting all the loose wires to make sure they're tidy. And then we'll be connecting them based on the pictures that I took when we disassembled it. And then we'll be applying permanent terminal nuts on there as opposed to wire nuts. these crimp, and after I got all those installed, I zip tied it all together to make it nice and tidy. That way there's not a nest of wiring hanging down inside the head. Like so. Now we're ready to install it on the head, so we just drop it right in place and then attach it with the 4 screws that it came with. I added washers because these screw heads were kind of small. Next, we've got the guard for the belt cover, and we install it with 4 screws. Now these screws had lock washers under them, and the parts diagram doesn't call for them, but when I installed them without the lock washers, the guard had some play in it, so I went back and added the lock washers back into it. And for some reason, when we were lubing everything else, we forgot to lube the head, so I lubed all of the bores on the head and any of the exposed metal, like that ring across the top. And then we're going to assemble the spindle pulley assembly. Again, Nachi bearings, brand new. So we just slide that down on the shaft. And then I'm going to reach across the camera and grab the spacer. Drop the spacer on there. Then the other bearing. There's a spreadsheet in the description of all of these videos that has all of the bearing sizes and all of that information in case you need it. Drop that second bearing on there. Then we've got the retaining ring. This is the outer retaining ring. Snap it on there. Make sure everything's good and tight. And I wasn't paying attention to the camera, so I apologize. You don't see me actually sitting the spindle pulley assembly in the head. It's sitting in there right now, and I'm going to tap it in, but I got it kind of cocked to one side, so I need to square that away. And then once it's good, go ahead and tap it in. And you know that this is fully seated when you see the gap that's there right now between the bottom sheave and the head. That's the gap that you want, that small, like 1/16 of an inch gap. And then we've got the machine screw that holds the spindle pulley assembly in the head. There's only one on this drill press. All the drill presses before this, Gen 1s and the King Sealy drill presses, have one on each side. But the Gen 2 starts the trend of using only one machine screw. So next we're just lubing up the headlock. So we've got the lock nut, which is what I'm holding now, and then we've got the sleeve, and then we've got the lock screw handle. And we're just putting super lube on everything. And once we got that ready to go, then we'll be ready to mount the head on the column. So if you notice the lock nut that's sitting on the towel right now, it's got 2 flat angles on it. And that's so you can have the handle, when you lock it down, either facing in one direction or opposite that direction. You'll see what I mean in a second here. So we're just going to line up the head, slide it down, line up the second bore, and boom. That column lock that column collar comes in real handy. So here we're putting the lock nut in on the far side. Those flats align with the column because that's what they're engaging. And we'll slide the lock sleeve on the screw on this side and then line it up and lock it down. So with the lock nut on the other side facing the direction it is, this is where that handle wants to lock, but I want the handle to lock in the other position. So I'm going to back it back out. And I'm going to pull that nut out and rotate it 180 degrees. And then when I put it back together and lock it down, it's going to make sure that the handle is facing in the direction I want it to face. And that's going to wrap up this video. So part 7 done. Part 8, we will be finishing this drill press. So we're almost there. As always, I appreciate everybody's support. Please like and subscribe. If you got questions, post them in the discussion section, and I will see you next time.